Are you looking to improve your Reading Part A scores? If yes, you're in the right place. My name is Rachel. I'm a certified OET preparation provider, bringing you the advice and the practice you need to successfully pass your OET. In this video, we're looking at how to effectively manage your time for Reading Part A, and this is notoriously one of the biggest challenges of this section. So what I want to do with you is teach you some tips when you're pre-reading before you get to the questions to help you better locate the answers more quickly. And what we're going to do, I'm going to talk through a few examples of the type of text you can see, and then I will demonstrate with 1.5 minutes of previewing those texts what that looks like. So let me talk first about the types of texts. The first type is one that has lists. And you can see, if we scroll through, we see our text topic is the use of feeding tubes in pediatrics. And we see from text A down to text B, down to text C, and text D. There's different styles of how the information is presented. So that first one, as I said, is the list. You know it's a list when you see things like bullet points, for example, or dashes, or anything that breaks up the information but groups it so it has one thing in common. And that is your key. Instead of spending your time reading the details of the list, you should be looking above the list at what introduction statement is there, or briefly looking at the first few words in each item to see what do they have in common. And if I were to ask you, you should be able to tell me in a 2 to 3 word summary, what does all of this list have in common? So let's take a few quick examples there. You'll see text A, right? Issues associated with pediatric nasogastric tube feeding include. So we can assume that everything underneath there is an issue. So it sounds simple, right? In this example, it comes right at the beginning. But in some examples, you'll have to read through a little bit more carefully to find the theme. The other thing is vocabulary. So when we think issues, we're going to think to the text questions that we see. You may not see the word issues, but what other words are similar to that? Well, something like complications or risks, right? So those are the sort of vocabulary raising activities we should be doing. Quickly, let's see text B. We also see lists, so that's what you should be focused on. Again, the theme here. We see the first one, number 1 and 2. Well, wide bore, fine bore, and we quickly see that there are different properties that are being listed. So length of time, how often to change, sizes, right? So rather than reading every single piece of information, you should be able to tell me, here they're dividing the information into 2 types based on these characteristics. So in short, the characteristics of these tubes. Then we go further down, and this list is extensive, so be careful here. Don't spend too much time reading every item. What I want you to do here is preview this sentence above. We see wash and dry hands thoroughly, place all equipment needed on a clean tray. So it's not immediately obvious what the theme of this list is. So if you don't see a key word in the introduction, you may have to do a bit of analysis quickly with the grammar. So what do we see? Well, if I skim every item here, I see find, check, measure, lubricate, gently pass, I see remove, and I see lightly secure. What do all of those have in common? They're all actions, or in other words, they're all instructions or protocols. So we don't have in the beginning sentence the protocols to follow include. However, if we look at the list and you see a lot of actions, often that's instructions, or in this case, it could also be techniques. If you see a lot of nouns, right, that might be getting at some of the characteristics or properties again. So the grammar that you see that is consistent can help you in the preview. So that's the first type of text where you have lists. Lists are nice because they have one thing in common and you can skim them quickly. The other type is when you have a chart or a flow chart. So let's take a look down at text C. One of the big mistakes that will cost you time is to start reading all of the details of this chart. No, in the preview, what you need to find out is how is the information being sorted? And the best way to do that is to look at the decisions, so you have yes and no, and look at what is being decided. So in this case, we see the word aspirate not only once, but twice. So we know, in short, this is a flowchart summarizing when to, or what to do if aspirate is or isn't obtained, I should say. Not only that, there is some final pieces as well: proceed to feed and do not feed. So if I was to summarize this in short, I would say decisions about obtaining aspirate and proceeding with feeding. That's all I need in my preview. However, always note if there's something at the bottom. There's often some additional information or supplementary notes, and those might have one or two questions depending on the test. So if you're not sure where to find the information, skim the notes section. They may be asking you something about that. The final type of text, so we had lists, we have charts like this, the flow chart. Don't forget, you can also have graphs where there are x-axes and y-axes and you're finding that information. It's also decision-based, so yes and no. Instead of those decisions, it's how much of this and how much of that, and that will tell you what to look for. So when we're thinking about the questions, we're thinking in terms of questions that are framed as decisions or conditions. That's going to help you find the answer. The third and final type of text there is the one that has no obvious structure. So there's no list, there's no headings, it's sentences or it's paragraphs. These are more challenging because there's not an obvious theme. What I advise you to do is to skim for words that repeat. Here, as you can see right off the start without reading anything, you see the word feed come up almost every single line or paragraph, right? Now we have to be careful. Other places in the text also had the word feed. However, when we're focusing on the specifics of feeding, we can see there administering feed/fluid via a feeding tube. That's the first part, right? That's sort of a heading or sort of an introduction, but we see that the rest of the pieces are getting at different aspects of that feeding process. So a good clue is in your questions about feeding specifically, this is where you would go. But be careful if it's just using the word feed in a general sense and there's other clues in the question, we have to be careful not to assume they're all going to be in text D. So now that you've seen that run through, three types of text, know what to look for if it's a list, if it's a chart, or if it's a paragraph or sentence structure. Let me demonstrate this with the time component, and I want to do this in 1 to 3 minutes with you, and I will show you what this looks like speeded up. So I'm going to set my timer there for just about 1 to 1.5 minutes and see how we can do this. So if I was taking this exam, this is the process that I would go through. Let's begin. So I look at text A and I see that there's background information. Almost always there's some pre-information before getting into my first list. I see the word issues. I'm immediately thinking complications, risks, any problems. I expect that vocabulary. I move into text B and I see that it's talking more about that insertion process rather than just generally issues. So getting into the types of tubes, I see there's 2 here. I'm aware that that could cause confusion with my question, so I'm going to be careful with the details. I see lots of numbers, so when I see questions about time and length and size, I'm going to come back here. Then I see, okay, there's lots of action verbs, so this is telling me instructions or things to do in this process. And I see words like equipment, or I see various techniques. So those are my vocabulary I will look for in my questions. In text C, I see the decision is between whether aspirate is obtained or not, and that's the flow of the chart. It comes up a couple of times. Other repeated words include things like pH. I see that come up. I also see words like x-ray. So there's more in that terms of the technical. I also see some numbers looking very quickly. So if I see length or sizes or times, I could also find those here. And I note that there's a note at the bottom. Finally, in text D, I skim quickly through the sentences and I see there's lots of feed words appearing, but I see they're getting at different aspects of whether that's the actual procedure or the type of feeding, or who is involved. I see the dietitian listed here, the child listed here, so getting a sense of that as well. All right. That took me just under 2 minutes. When you do this in your head, this will be faster. You won't have to verbalize it. But I hope that gives you a good sense of what sort of pre-reading strategies help you when you then go to the questions, I should say. So here is your assigned task before I show you the next video. I'm going to show you the questions now. So pause the video, take a look at those questions. I want you to go through those questions and I will show you the text piece by piece so that you have them here. See if you are able to answer those questions 1 through 7 just based on what we actually saw with that vocabulary. Look for words such as risks or calculating the length, right? Alternative forms of feeding, who to consult, the outward appearance, knowing when a condition or a decision, right? How regularly, so timing. I want you to look at those 7 questions, and having seen that text and gone through that, go back through this video and see how quickly you can get questions 1 through 7. This should be very fast as you have already done the pre-reading part. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to manage the remaining 13 minutes to answer questions 1 through 20. Just a quick note, some of those questions will be faster. For example, questions 1 through 7 should be fast. The other questions I will show you go into more details. So we'll talk about strategies for finding the right text, finding the section of that text, finding the answer, and then carefully writing the answer in your answer sheet here. So if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, click the notification bell, and when the next video comes out, we will work through those things, and I will see you in that video.